Picture a 10-year-old boy being stripped naked in front of strangers, examined like livestock, then dressed in a red robe that marks him for a journey he'll never return from. This happened to hundreds of thousands of Christian children across the Ottoman Empire for over 400 years. Newly translated Janissary registers provide unprecedented detail about this systematic process. Every 3 to 4 years, Ottoman officials would enter Christian villages with a simple mission: select the strongest, smartest boys and transform them into Muslim warriors. But the reality was far more complex and disturbing than historians have revealed. Why did some families actually bribe officials to take their sons? What made children as young as 8 fight other prisoners to prove their worthiness for enslavement? And what dark psychological techniques could turn a Serbian shepherd boy into a general commanding armies against his own people? The evidence we've gathered reveals a system of human engineering so sophisticated it created an empire and ultimately consumed itself. Subscribe to see the forensic evidence that shows exactly how they broke these children's minds and why the results were more horrifying than the methods themselves. The acrid smell of gunpowder still hung heavy in the Istanbul air on June 15, 1826. Smoke drifted across the cobblestones of the Janissary barracks courtyard, mixing with something far more disturbing, the metallic stench of blood pooling between ancient stones. 6,000 bodies lay scattered where they had fallen, cut down not by foreign enemies, but by their own Sultan's artillery. These weren't ordinary soldiers. These were the Janissaries, the elite corps that had terrorized Europe for centuries. The unstoppable force that had brought down the Byzantine Empire and struck fear into the hearts of Christian kings from Vienna to Venice. Now they were nothing more than cooling corpses, their white turbans soaked crimson, their curved swords still clutched in death grips. What you're witnessing is the end of the most successful slave army in human history. Every single man lying dead in that courtyard had a story that would chill you to the bone. Each had once been a Christian child, torn from their family's arms and transformed through methods so brutal, so psychologically sophisticated, that they became willing to die for the very faith that had enslaved them. Their grandfathers had been Orthodox Christians. Their great-grandfathers had knelt before wooden crosses in Serbian churches or Greek monasteries. Yet here they lay, having spent their final moments crying, "Allah!" as Ottoman cannons tore them apart. The Sultan who ordered this massacre knew exactly what he was destroying. These weren't just soldiers, they were the perfect weapons, forged through centuries of psychological conditioning that began the moment Ottoman officials selected them as children. The system that created them was so effective, it had built one of history's greatest empires, stretching across 3 continents and lasting 600 years. So why did it have to end in such carnage? Why did the very empire these slave soldiers had built ultimately decide that its perfect warriors had become too dangerous to live? The answer lies buried in documents that reveal a truth so disturbing, mainstream historians have barely scratched its surface. But how did Christian children become the Sultan's most feared weapons? How does an empire transform kidnapped boys into men who would conquer their own homeland? What you're about to discover will fundamentally change everything you thought you knew about power, control, and the terrifying adaptability of the human mind. To understand the true horror of what happened in that blood-soaked courtyard, you need to grasp the sheer scale of what these men had built. The Ottoman Empire at its peak wasn't just another medieval kingdom. It was a superpower, spanning 3 continents, controlling trade routes from Vienna to Baghdad, from the Crimean Peninsula to the gates of Cairo. For 600 years, this empire dominated the known world, and at its heart stood the most revolutionary military force Europe had ever seen: the Janissaries. Everything you think you know about medieval armies is wrong. These weren't feudal levies or tribal warriors. They were the world's first modern standing army. Professional soldiers with standardized training, regular pay, and technological superiority that made European knights look like children playing with wooden swords. But here's the contradiction that will make your blood run cold. This Muslim empire's unstoppable force was led almost entirely by converted Christians. From 1365 to 1826, for 461 years, The Ottomans perfected a system of institutionalized slavery that affected millions across the Balkans to the Caucasus. Subscribe to uncover the hidden documents that reveal exactly how they turned Christian children into Islam's perfect weapons. But why did the Ottomans need to create such a system in the first place? The answer lies in the brutal realities of 14th century expansion that would drive any empire to desperate measures. Picture the Ottoman state in its infancy. A small frontier principality surrounded by enemies, barely clinging to existence in western Anatolia. To survive, they had to expand. To expand, they needed armies. But here's where the nightmare began. They couldn't trust anyone. The traditional Turkish tribal armies were unreliable, bound by ancient loyalties that shifted like desert sand. When war came, tribal chiefs might decide their personal interests mattered more than the Sultan's commands. They could switch sides, demand impossible ransoms, or simply vanish when the battle turned ugly. The Turkish nobility was even worse. Ambitious, scheming aristocrats who saw every victory as an opportunity to carve out their own kingdoms. Sultan Murad, I watched his predecessors struggle with this same poisonous dynamic and realized something that would change the course of history. If you can't trust your own people, you need to create people you can trust. What they created was more disturbing than anyone imagined. The proof of concept came at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, where something unprecedented happened. A massive coalition of Serbian and Bosnian forces, desperate to stop Ottoman expansion, assembled what should have been an overwhelming army. They had superior numbers, knowledge of the terrain, and the fury of men fighting for their homeland. Against them, Murad deployed just 2 Janissaries alongside his regular troops. Those 2 men didn't just win the battle, they broke the spine of Balkan resistance for centuries. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. Those 2 warriors fighting for the Ottoman Empire weren't Ottoman by birth. They were Serbian, Bulgarian, and Albanian boys who had been taken from villages just like the ones they were now conquering. Murad, I had discovered something that would make your skin crawl. A way to transform an empire's greatest weakness into its ultimate strength. The documents we discovered reveal the precise mechanics of this system. And they're more methodical, more psychologically sophisticated, and more systematically cruel than anything you've seen in your worst nightmares. But first, you need to understand exactly what happened when those officials in red robes appeared at the village gates, because what they did next would echo through centuries and leave scars on millions of families that never healed. The system had a name that still makes historians uncomfortable to say out loud: devshirme. In Turkish, it simply means to collect or to gather. But for millions of Christian families across the Balkans, it meant something far more sinister: the blood tax. Every 3 to 4 years, like clockwork, Ottoman officials would appear at Christian village gates carrying leather-bound registers, measuring tools, and a quota they had to fill. What happened next was so systematically brutal that it violated the very religious laws the Ottoman Empire claimed to uphold. Yet it continued for over 4 centuries because it worked too well to stop. Picture the scene. Serbian Orthodox villages where church bells had rung for generations suddenly falling silent as foreign officials in elaborate robes conducted what they called the collection. They weren't collecting grain or gold, they were collecting children. Boys aged 7 to 20. Though newly discovered Ottoman registers reveal the reality was far more calculated than even these broad age ranges suggest. The selection process was methodical, almost scientific in its precision. Ottoman officials would examine each boy like livestock, checking their teeth, measuring their height, testing their reflexes, evaluating their intelligence through simple questions and tasks. They recorded everything: physical appearance, family background, signs of disease or deformity, even personality traits that might indicate future loyalty or rebellion. Those who passed this human inspection were marked for a journey that would strip away everything they had ever known: their name, their faith, their family, their very identity. The geographic scope of this human harvesting was staggering. Serbia, Bulgaria, Albania, Greece, Bosnia, parts of Hungary and Romania. Entire regions lived in terror of the devshirme years, knowing that when those officials appeared, some of their children would never come home. The boys who were selected faced forced conversion to Islam, circumcision, and systematic psychological conditioning designed to transform them into the Sultan's most loyal servants. But here's what makes this system even more disturbing. It was completely illegal according to Islamic law. The Quran specifically protects people of the book, Christians and Jews, guaranteeing them safety and religious freedom under Muslim rule. The devshirme violated every principle of this protection, turning it into a mockery. Even Ottoman scholars knew this. Mustafa Ali, a prominent 16th-century Ottoman historian, wrote with startling honesty that devshirme violated Sharia, but was allowed only out of necessity. Think about that admission for a moment. The Ottoman Empire's own intellectuals acknowledged they were systematically breaking their religious laws. But they did it anyway because the results were too valuable to abandon. The necessity Ali referenced wasn't survival. It was the creation of perfect human weapons. Soldiers whose loyalty couldn't be questioned because it had been literally beaten and conditioned into them from childhood. But the documents we've uncovered reveal that the reality of how this system actually operated was far more complex and disturbing than these official acknowledgments suggest, because the Ottomans discovered something terrifying about human psychology that they exploited with surgical precision. The precision of this psychological exploitation becomes crystal clear when you examine how the selection process actually unfolded, because what the Ottomans created wasn't a random raid. It was a sophisticated bureaucratic machine designed to break families and communities with methodical efficiency. When the Turnachubashu arrived in a target region, he didn't come alone or unprepared. He carried an official decree bearing the Sultan's seal, 2 identical leather-bound registers for recording every detail of every boy examined, bundles of red uniforms in various sizes, and a small army of assistants trained in human evaluation techniques that would make modern psychologists uncomfortable. Picture this happening in your hometown for 6 months. Because that's exactly how long this process took. Not the quick lightning raids that most people imagine. The newly discovered Ottoman court records from the 1603–1604 levy reveal the shocking truth. Officials would arrive in October and wouldn't complete their work until February or March of the following year. For half a year, entire communities lived under the shadow of systematic child theft, watching as neighbors' sons were examined, measured, categorized, and either marked for collection or temporarily spared. The selection criteria were brutally specific. Physical strength was tested through lifting exercises and endurance challenges, intelligence through memory games and problem-solving tasks, appearance through detailed examinations that recorded eye color, hair texture, skin tone, scars, birthmarks, even the shape of eyebrows. But here's where the system becomes truly sinister. The officials weren't just looking for strong, smart, attractive boys. They were specifically seeking children who showed psychological traits that could be exploited, curiosity that could be redirected into loyalty, aggression that could be channeled into military effectiveness, adaptability that could survive the trauma of identity destruction. Once selected, boys were immediately dressed in identical red robes and conical red caps, not for ceremony, but for practical control. The red made escape impossible. A child running through the countryside in bright red clothing would be spotted immediately and returned for punishment. But the psychological impact was just as important. The uniform marked the beginning of identity erasure. The first step in transforming Marko, the Serbian shepherd boy, into Mehmet, the Ottoman warrior. The 2-register system reveals the industrial precision of this operation. Every physical detail was recorded twice: height, weight, distinguishing marks, family information, village of origin, with one copy traveling with the boys and another remaining with local officials. This wasn't just for tracking. It was for preventing forgery, ensuring that boys couldn't be switched out or ransomed back, and maintaining complete control over human inventory. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the families were forced to pay for their children's enslavement. The cost of the red uniforms, transportation, food during the journey, Even the officials' lodging, all of it was charged to the villages losing their sons. Parents had to fund their own children's disappearance, adding financial devastation to emotional destruction. But what happened during those long months of selection was only the beginning, because the journey to Istanbul would reveal psychological conditioning techniques so sophisticated they would reshape the very concept of human identity. The true scope of this systematic horror remained hidden for centuries, until historians uncovered a document so detailed, so forensically precise, that it reads like a modern police investigation report. In October 1603, a Turnachubasha named Mustafa arrived in Bursa, carrying what would become the most comprehensive record of child conscription ever discovered: the Eshkal Defter, a register that documented every physical detail of every boy examined during the 1603–1604 devshirme levy. This isn't some vague historical chronicle filled with flowery language and approximations. This is hard data, recorded with the clinical precision of men who knew they were conducting an industrial operation on human beings. The numbers alone will shock you. 604 boys conscripted across the entire empire that year, with 530 taken specifically from the Bursa region. But here's where everything you think you know about this system gets turned upside down. The age data reveals that the Ottoman officials weren't primarily targeting small children. The average age was 16.5 years, and a staggering 41% of the boys were between 18 and 20 years old. These weren't innocent little boys torn from their mother's arms. These were teenagers and young men, old enough to understand exactly what was happening to them, old enough to fight back, old enough to remember everything they were losing. The register documents their physical characteristics with forensic detail that would impress modern investigators. Height categorized as tall, medium, or short relative to age. Eye color recorded as black, brown, hazel, bluish hazel, or blue. Skin tone classified as dark, brown, blonde, or fair. Even eyebrow shape and color meticulously noted. But it's the medical evidence that reveals the true brutality of life in early 17th century Balkans. 6% of these boys bore the unmistakable marks of bubonic plague. Huyarchuk Yarasi, the scarred buboes that marked plague survivors. 7% carried smallpox scars across their faces, permanent reminders of a disease that killed more children than it spared. Most shocking of all, 62% of these boys had scars on their faces or hands, evidence of violence, accidents, or harsh living conditions that marked their bodies before the Ottomans ever touched them. The register doesn't just record that a boy had scars, it documents their exact location with surgical precision. Round scar behind the right ear, long mark on top of the head inside the hair, small scar on the index finger of his left hand, mark following his left eyebrow. This wasn't bureaucratic thoroughness. This was criminal identification methodology, creating detailed physical profiles that would make it impossible for these boys to escape or be replaced by substitutes. Disease pattern analysis of this register reveals living conditions so harsh that a quarter of all conscripted boys had survived major epidemic diseases before age 20. These weren't pampered village children. They were already hardened survivors. Young men who had endured plague, smallpox, violence, and poverty. The Ottomans weren't just collecting random boys. They were specifically selecting the strongest, most resilient specimens from populations that had already been naturally selected by disease and hardship. But what this forensic documentation doesn't capture is the psychological transformation that began the moment these boys were loaded into transport groups. Because the journey to Istanbul would reveal conditioning techniques so sophisticated they could turn a plague-scarred Serbian teenager into a man willing to die for the Sultan who had enslaved him. But what does it actually feel like to survive this system from the inside? For centuries, that question remained unanswered because the victims rarely lived to tell their stories, and when they did, they rarely wanted to remember. Then historians discovered a memoir that changes everything we thought we knew about the psychological impact of Ottoman conditioning. The first-hand account of Konstantin Mihailovich, a Serbian Christian boy who was conscripted in 1455 and lived to write about it 40 years later. His testimony reveals a truth so psychologically complex, so disturbing in its implications about human adaptability, that it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about survival, loyalty, and what people are willing to become to stay alive. Constantine was 20 years old when Ottoman forces besieged the Serbian fortress of Novo Brdo in 1455, old enough to understand exactly what was happening when the walls fell and Ottoman officials began their systematic sorting of the conquered population. He watched as 700 women and girls were distributed among the Ottoman soldiers like spoils of war, witnessed the execution of every man of importance or rank, and found himself among 320 boys selected for the Janissary Corps. What makes his memoir so chilling isn't just the brutality he describes, but the gradual psychological transformation he underwent from Serbian Christian to Ottoman warrior. Within 2 years of his conscription, Constantine was fighting on the walls of Constantinople in 1453, not as a prisoner or reluctant conscript, but as a committed soldier in the Ottoman army that brought down the last remnant of the Byzantine Empire. Think about that for a moment. A Serbian Christian boy, stolen from his homeland, was enthusiastically participating in the conquest of Christianity's eastern capital just 2 years after his enslavement. But it gets worse. Constantine's memoir describes his subsequent campaigns against Vlad the Impaler, the historical Dracula, where he fought alongside fellow Janissaries against the very Christian resistance movements that might have liberated him. He battled against Skanderbeg, the Albanian hero who had himself escaped Ottoman slavery, only to become their most dangerous enemy. Constantine was fighting against men who represented everything he had once been. And the psychological implications of that betrayal echo through every page of his testimony. The most disturbing aspect of Constantine's story isn't his initial enslavement, it's his success within the system. By 1463, he had risen to command 50 Janissaries and 30 Turkish soldiers, trusted with the defense of the strategic fortress at Zvečaj. This wasn't a man barely surviving his captivity. This was someone who had internalized Ottoman values so completely that he had become a leader within the very system that had destroyed his original identity. His memoir reveals the terrifying effectiveness of Ottoman psychological conditioning, showing how systematic isolation, religious conversion, military training, and the promise of advancement could transform a Serbian shepherd boy into an Ottoman officer who commanded troops against his own people. Constantine only escaped in 1463 when his fortress fell to Hungarian forces, and he opportunistically declared his return to Christianity. But his memoir, written decades later between 1497 and 1501, reveals a man still grappling with the psychological complexity of his experience. He had been a victim, yes, but also a perpetrator. A survivor who had thrived within a system designed to erase his very existence. His testimony forces us to confront a disturbing truth about the Ottoman system. It didn't just break people. It gave them a pathway to power that many found impossible to resist, and that psychological seduction was perhaps the most effective weapon the Ottomans ever created. But Constantine's story of psychological adaptation and advancement only tells one side of this nightmare. Because for every boy who internalized Ottoman conditioning, there were others who never stopped fighting, never stopped trying to escape, never stopped remembering who they really were. What the official Ottoman chronicles deliberately concealed was the scale of resistance that threatened to tear their perfect system apart from within, a resistance so widespread and so violent that it forced the empire to develop increasingly brutal countermeasures that revealed the true depths of their desperation to maintain control. The hidden documents we've uncovered paint a picture of systematic rebellion that official histories have spent centuries trying to erase. In 1540, when Ottoman officials arrived in Alexandria, Albania, to conduct their routine devshirme levy, something unprecedented happened. The villagers fought back, not with words or petitions, but with weapons. They attacked the collection officers, wounded several, and drove them from the village in what amounted to armed rebellion against the Sultan's authority. This wasn't an isolated incident of desperation. It was part of a pattern of violent resistance that spread across the Balkans like wildfire. 18 years later, in 1558, the entire region around Elbasan erupted in coordinated revolt when villagers simply refused to hand over their children and backed up that refusal with organized military resistance that required Ottoman troops to suppress. But perhaps the most shocking act of parental desperation occurred in 1564, when villagers from Sis did something so audacious it should have been impossible. They traveled all the way to Istanbul and successfully kidnapped their own children back from the heart of the Ottoman system. Think about the courage and desperation required for that mission. Christian peasants infiltrating the imperial capital, somehow locating their sons among thousands of conscripts, and executing a rescue operation under the noses of the Sultan's guards. The fact that they succeeded reveals just how extensive the underground networks supporting resistance had become. The scale of internal rebellion becomes truly staggering when you examine the desertion statistics that Ottoman officials desperately tried to suppress. In a single incident in 1626, 404 devshirme boys simply vanished, not killed in battle, not transferred to other units, but missing, presumably escaped or dead attempting to escape. From Edirne alone, 467 gardener boys managed to desert en masse, representing the collapse of an entire training program. These weren't individual acts of rebellion. They were coordinated mass escapes that suggest sophisticated resistance networks operating throughout the empire. The Ottoman response to this hemorrhaging of human resources reveals the true brutality underlying their system. Captured escapees weren't simply returned to service. They were recorded in the registers and then killed. That clinical phrase, buried in administrative documents, represents a death sentence for any boy brave enough or desperate enough to attempt freedom. The empire had invested too much in these human weapons to allow defection, and they were willing to murder children to maintain the system's psychological control over the survivors. Families developed increasingly sophisticated strategies to protect their sons, bribing officials to exclude their children from selection, arranging hasty marriages to boys below the usual age to make them ineligible, hiding children in remote mountain villages during levy years, even mutilating their sons to make them physically unsuitable for military service. Christian solidarity networks emerged across the Balkans, with entire communities coordinating to protect runaways, providing safe houses, false documents, and escape routes that stretched from Serbian villages to Hungarian borderlands. The islands of Marmara and Mir Ali became known refuges where priests and village leaders would hide escaped boys, despite knowing that discovery meant their own execution. But what makes this resistance even more remarkable is that it persisted despite the Ottoman state's increasingly sophisticated countermeasures, because the empire had discovered that the threat to their system wasn't just physical escape, it was the psychological contamination that occurred when other conscripts witnessed successful rebellion, and they would go to horrifying lengths to prevent that contamination from spreading. Yet here's where this story takes a turn so psychologically twisted, so morally complex, that it forces us to confront the most disturbing truth about the Ottoman devshirme system. It actually worked exactly as designed, and some of its victims rose to heights of power that would have been impossible in any other medieval society, creating a paradox that haunts every attempt to understand this institution's true legacy. Between 1522 and 1536, the second most powerful man in the entire Ottoman Empire wasn't a Turkish aristocrat, wasn't a member of the Sultan's family, he wasn't even born Muslim. He was Ibrahim Pasha, a Christian boy who had been stolen from his Greek family and transformed through the devshirme system into the Sultan's right hand, commanding armies, negotiating with European monarchs, and effectively running the day-to-day operations of one of history's greatest empires. Ibrahim wasn't an exception. He was the rule, the proof of concept that the Ottoman system of human engineering had achieved something unprecedented in human history: the systematic replacement of an empire's ruling class with their own former slaves. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, born a Serbian Orthodox Christian, served as Grand Vizier for 14 years, and was the de facto ruler of the Ottoman Empire during the reigns of 3 different sultans, wielding more real power than most European kings while never forgetting that he had once knelt in a Serbian church listening to Orthodox hymns in a language the Ottomans had tried to make him forget. By the height of the system, Grand Viziers from devshirme backgrounds dramatically outnumbered those from traditional Turkish noble families, creating the ultimate irony. The slaves had literally replaced their masters at the pinnacle of imperial power. This wasn't just social mobility. This was a complete inversion of the natural order that medieval Europe thought was divinely ordained. A world where a kidnapped shepherd boy could become more powerful than princes born to purple. Where former Christians ruled over the Turkish aristocracy that had originally enslaved them. The psychological complexity of this transformation defies easy categorization. Because these men weren't just victims who had adapted to survive. They were active participants in a system that continued to enslave children from their own homelands, yet some never entirely forgot their origins. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha secretly restored the Serbian Orthodox Patriarchate and appointed his own Christian brother as archbishop, using his position at the heart of Islamic power to protect the very faith the Ottomans had tried to steal from him. Other devshirme graduates found more desperate ways to reconcile their fractured identities, as revealed in the haunting testimonies of former Janissaries who appeared before Catholic Inquisition courts across Europe, men who had achieved success and wealth and power beyond imagination, yet felt compelled to seek absolution for the crimes they had committed in service to the empire that had created them. These testimonies, discovered in Sicilian and Venetian archives, reveal men tormented by the psychological complexity of their experiences. Marian Zali, who had served as a palace cook and risen through the Janissary ranks to fight in major campaigns, yet at age 37 traveled to Sicily to confess that he had never forgotten his Christian origins and begged for spiritual absolution. Georgian of Michelis, who had become chef of gardens, responsible for surveillance and policing in Istanbul itself, yet retired from his position of ultimate trust to seek forgiveness from the very Christian authorities his empire considered enemies. The devshirme system had created something historically unique. A ruling class that was simultaneously the most loyal servants of imperial power and its most psychologically conflicted beneficiaries, men who wielded unprecedented authority while carrying the permanent trauma of cultural genocide, success stories who remained living monuments to the system's capacity to reshape human identity so completely that victims could become perpetrators while never entirely losing the memory of what they had lost. But this psychological contradiction that produced such effective rulers would ultimately become the system's greatest weakness, because men who remembered being powerless children would eventually remember what it felt like to have power used against them. And they would begin to use that same power in ways their creators never intended. The psychological torment of men like Marian Zali and Georges of Michelis seemed destined to remain buried in dusty Inquisition archives. Just another tragic footnote in history's catalog of human suffering, until September 2024, when the Mediterranean Sea itself began surrendering evidence that would fundamentally change our understanding of how deep this system of human transformation actually penetrated Ottoman society. Off the coast of Datça in southwestern Turkey, marine archaeologists from Dokuz Eylül University's Underwater Research Center made a discovery so significant that it sent shockwaves through the historical community: the Kizilin Ottoman shipwreck, the first physical evidence ever found of Janissary naval operations, a time capsule from the 17th century that had been waiting 400 years to tell its story. The ship itself is a revelation, its starboard fragments revealing construction techniques that speak to the sophisticated naval engineering of the Ottoman fleet. But it's the cargo that makes your blood run cold, because this wasn't a merchant vessel or a diplomatic mission. This was a warship that had been in active combat when it sank, and the evidence is written in lead and gunpowder across the seafloor. 14 Janissary rifles lie scattered among the wreckage, their wooden stocks still intact after centuries underwater. Each one a personal weapon that had been carried by a converted Christian boy turned Islamic warrior each one a testament to the Ottoman Empire's ability to transform stolen children into naval forces capable of projecting power across the Mediterranean. Approximately 500 lead musket balls carpet the wreck site alongside exploded cannonballs, physical proof that this ship had been engaged in fierce battle when it went down, that these weapons had been fired in anger, that the men wielding them had died fighting for the empire that had enslaved their predecessors. Modern forensic analysis of the ship's contents reveals details that chronicle the complexity of Ottoman imperial operations. Sets of blue-painted porcelain bowls, manufactured in China specifically for Islamic markets and found carefully packaged, suggesting this vessel was carrying diplomatic gifts even as it conducted military operations. Ceramics from Tunisia's Jerba region indicating the ship's North African origins and the vast geographic network that connected Ottoman military operations across the Mediterranean. Copper vessels and personal items that speak to the daily lives of the men who sailed and fought aboard this vessel. The archaeological significance of this discovery cannot be overstated because it fills a crucial gap in the historical record, providing the first physical evidence of how the devshirme system extended beyond land-based Janissary corps into naval operations, revealing that the Ottoman strategy of using converted Christians as military forces was even more comprehensive than previously understood. Expert analysis of the artifact suggests the ship sank during the second half of the 17th century, a time when the devshirme system was at its peak efficiency, when boys like those documented in the Bursa Register were being transformed not just into elite infantry, but into naval warriors capable of projecting Ottoman power from the Black Sea to the Atlantic coast of Morocco. Each artifact recovered from the Kizlan wreck represents a voice from the grave, physical evidence of lives lived and lost in service to an empire that had systematically erased the identities of its most effective servants. But these underwater voices are about to be joined by something far more disturbing. Evidence of how this entire system ultimately consumed itself, how the perfect weapons became so perfect that they threatened the very empire that had created them. But these voices from beneath the Mediterranean waves were already echoes from a dying system. Because by the time the Kizlan ship sank in the 17th century, the very success of the devshirme program was creating a problem that would ultimately force the Ottoman Empire to make an unthinkable choice: destroy the foundation of their power, or watch that foundation destroy them instead. We're about to return to that blood-soaked courtyard in Istanbul, to those 6-0 bodies cooling in the morning air. But now you'll understand exactly why Sultan Mahmud II decided that his empire's most perfect warriors had to die. And the answer will reveal the most disturbing truth about institutionalized power. Sometimes the greatest threat to a system comes not from its failures, but from its successes. By 1826, the Janissaries had become everything the devshirme system was designed to create, and everything it was designed to prevent. They were utterly loyal to the Ottoman state, but they had also become a political force so powerful that they could make and unmake sultans at will. They were the empire's most effective military unit, but they were also an entrenched interest group that blocked every attempt at modernization because change threatened their privileged position. They were the perfect products of systematic indoctrination. But that same indoctrination had taught them that their way of war, their traditions, their methods were divinely ordained and could never be improved upon. Sultan Mahmud II understood what his predecessors had been too afraid to acknowledge. The slave army that had built the Ottoman Empire had become its greatest liability, a force so set in their ways, so politically entrenched, so convinced of their own invincibility that they would rather see the empire fall than allow it to adapt to the modern world. But it gets worse. Mahmud II didn't stumble into the massacre of June 15, 1826. He orchestrated it with the same calculating precision that his ancestors had used to design the devshirme system itself. He deliberately provoked the Janissaries by announcing the formation of a new, Western-style military unit. Knowing they would revolt, knowing they would march on his palace, knowing they would give him the excuse he needed to unleash modern artillery on medieval warriors and call it justified defense. When the Janissaries gathered in their traditional barracks, expecting to intimidate another sultan into submission as they had done countless times before. They found themselves facing cannons loaded with grapeshot, weapons that could tear through massed infantry formations like paper, technology that made their individual courage and traditional tactics utterly irrelevant. The smell of gunpowder and burning flesh that hung over Istanbul that morning wasn't just the end of a rebellion. It was the physical manifestation of modernity, destroying tradition, of industrial warfare, obliterating personal combat, of systematic efficiency replacing human skill. But the slaughter in Istanbul was only the beginning. Because Mahmud II understood that as long as any Janissaries remained alive, they would represent a rallying point for resistance to his modernization efforts. The Blood Tower of Thessaloniki became the site of mass executions where surviving Janissaries were systematically hunted down and killed, their heads displayed as warnings to anyone who might remember the old ways with nostalgia. The empire was literally modernizing by destroying its own foundation, burning the human bridge that had carried it from medieval principality to global superpower. The ultimate question that haunts this entire story finally crystallizes in that moment. Did the devshirme system work too well? Had the Ottomans created human weapons so perfect, so psychologically conditioned, so institutionally entrenched that they became incapable of evolution, frozen in the methods that had made them successful but unable to adapt when those methods became obsolete? The blood pooling between those Istanbul cobblestones represented more than the death of 6 men. It marked the moment when an empire chose its future over its past, when the descendants of stolen Christian children were sacrificed to the same calculating logic that had created them in the first place, proving that in the end, even the most successful systems of human control carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. The blood has long since been washed from those Istanbul cobblestones, but the questions raised by what happened there echo through every subsequent century, forcing us to confront truths about power, control, and human nature that we'd rather not acknowledge. Because the Ottoman devshirme system wasn't an historical aberration, it was a perfected example of something that continues to happen whenever institutions discover they can reshape human beings to serve their purposes rather than adapting their purposes to serve human beings. Look around the modern world and you'll see the same psychological mechanisms at work. Child soldiers in Central Africa, torn from their families and conditioned to kill for warlords who understand that broken children make more loyal warriors than willing adults. Forced assimilation programs that strip indigenous children of their languages, religions, and cultural identities in the name of civilization and progress. Corporate cultures that demand such complete loyalty that employees lose their individual identities and become extensions of institutional will. The Ottoman Empire simply perfected what every power structure throughout history has attempted: the systematic transformation of human beings into instruments of control, and their success reveals something terrifying about our species' capacity for both inflicting and surviving psychological destruction. The price of imperial power has always been measured in human souls, but the devshirme system forces us to calculate that cost with unprecedented precision, because we can trace the exact process by which Marko, the Serbian shepherd boy, became Mehmet, the Ottoman general, and that transformation reveals the most disturbing truth about human adaptability. We can survive almost anything, including the complete erasure of who we used to be. But survival and healing are not the same thing. The unanswered questions that haunt this story are the ones that matter most. How many boys like Konstantin Mihailovich never adapted, never rose through the ranks, never found success within the system that destroyed them? How many broke completely under the psychological pressure and simply disappeared into madness or death without leaving any record of their suffering? How many carried the trauma of cultural genocide through their entire lives, achieving outward success while remaining internally shattered? The official records only document the survivors, the success stories, the men who became useful to the empire. But for every Ibrahim Pasha or Sokolu Mehmed Pasha who rose to power, how many thousands simply vanished into historical obscurity, their resistance crushed, their spirits broken, their stories lost forever? The final irony that defines the devshirme legacy is that the Ottoman Empire's most successful achievement became its greatest weakness. They created human weapons so perfect, so psychologically conditioned, so institutionally entrenched that these weapons ultimately turned on their creators not through rebellion, but through inflexibility, proving that absolute power corrupts not just those who wield it, but those who are shaped by it, creating a cycle of institutional decay that no amount of individual brilliance can overcome. The devshirme system succeeded too well, lasted too long, and ultimately demonstrated that even the most sophisticated methods of human control contain the seeds of their own destruction, because institutions that treat people as raw material for social engineering inevitably discover that human beings, no matter how thoroughly conditioned, retain the capacity to evolve in ways their creators never intended. Subscribe for more hidden histories that shaped our world, because understanding how power has always operated is the only way to recognize when it's operating on us, and the patterns revealed by 4 centuries of systematic child slavery echo through every structure of authority that demands we surrender our individual identity for the promise of collective purpose.